Hello and welcome to Alive and Composing and of course performing once in a while, the wonderful world of innova with today's guest, Eleonore Oppenheim. Would you please state your name for the record?
My name is Eleonore Oppenheim, for the record.
Now, you spell Eleanor the cool way.
I do.
How did that come about?
Actually, it went through a series of transformations. It started out the very old-fashioned way, with Eleanor, and then there was an E added at some point, and then the A became an O, and the rest is history.
Okay, so this was during your own lifetime. This wasn't the parents at baptism saying, a little argument about which would be cooler. No.
This was just an organic evolution, if you will.
Great. And this obviously ties in metaphorically to your life as an improviser and going with the flow and making things work to the best of your ability. Is that right?
Sure, yes.
The second psychological test that we do with all innova artists is cats, pets, domestic animals, dogs. What kind are you?
Well, I have a cat. I'm not sure that I am a cat. Is this like a what's your spirit animal question?
Very much so.
I guess I've never really done that with myself. I'm pretty good at guessing other people's spirit animals. I guess if I had to say, I might be some kind of, I don't know, definitely a creature that lives in the woods. We can narrow it down to that. Something probably furry that lives in the woods. Maybe Sasquatch? Does that count?
Is the ideal answer. We don't have any other Sasquatches.
Okay, good.
It happens in the innova catalog.
Okay, good.
You could be the first.
Yeah.
And do you have a pet name for your instrument?
Yes. I'll make the story shorter. Her name is Mrs. Pickles. And actually, Will Smith, who has a piece on my album, is the one who named her Mrs. Pickles. Because I was looking for a name, and he kind of decided it would be funny if we named her something that, like a 5-year-old would name their cat. So somehow Mrs. Pickles was the first thing that sprang to mind, and so her name is Mrs. Pickles.
This, of course, is one of the great advantages of performers working with living composers. You get to work things out jointly.
Exactly.
Now, cast your mind back. What's your first sound memory?
Probably my parents. They're both musicians. And I used to love listening to them when I was little. And I used to I remember liking to curl up underneath the piano on the floor when they were playing. It was just kind of cozy under there, and it was a nice place to kind of unobtrusively listen. And then also probably cleaning the house. My dad always used to put on like Motown and classic soul and stuff. So those were kind of cleaning the house and listening to James Brown, and then hearing my parents was probably two of my earliest sound memories.
Funnily enough, I can hear all of those things in the way you play. And the fact
Great.
of the double bass. Was it double bass your first instrument, or was it the underside of a piano?
No, it was prepared underside of piano. No, my first instrument was actually violin, and that was like a little too screechy for me. So then I moved up the food chain to cello. I skipped viola. Sorry, viola. I do appreciate you though. And played cello for quite a while. And then I wanted to be able to play with my parents. They're both jazz musicians. And so I ended up switching to the bass because you could do all the things that I wanted to do on it. Because I was really enjoying playing classical music, but I also wanted to be able to play other stuff. And the bass is an incredibly versatile instrument like that.
Right, so once you actually take up the bass, it kind of excludes you almost from the string quartet unless you play up the octave.
Right, but I still used to read string quartets with my friends in college at like reading parties and stuff, and I still try to do stuff like that. And like I was saying earlier off camera, I do enjoy playing some of the cello repertoire, as most bass players do.
Did you have a particular dream of what kind of musician you would be growing up, or was there schooling or teaching involved?
Well, it kind of metamorphosed. I started out thinking I was going to be like a, you know, a orchestral musician. And I think part of it had to do with my training. I started studying with Orrin O'Brien, who's in the New York Philharmonic, first woman in the Philharmonic ever. And she's obviously an orchestral musician, and so a lot of my technical training and repertoire involved, you know, orchestral repertoire, the kind of training that you give to musicians who are on an orchestra track. And that's a lot of standard conservatory education for bass players still, in general. And that's something I think we need to kind of get away from. But that's another conversation for another day. It wasn't really until graduate school I went through a period of wanting to be like a soloist. That was, you know, I was in my late teens and early 20s, just being stupid. And then I got to grad school, and Don Palma, my teacher in grad school, was really the first person to kind of encourage me to go off the beaten path in terms of what I wanted from my career. He was very encouraging about my interest in new music and in doing my own thing and playing chamber music, and kind of told me one day after I had taken maybe a couple of orchestra auditions and was just not pleased with the whole process, you know, you really don't have to do this. You could do whatever you want, and I think you'll be okay. So that was kind of the first inkling I got that it was all right to do all the other things. Because I had always been playing in bands and doing, you know, like a little jazz and some, you know, rock and roll and, you know, all the typical things that musicians want to do.
Was there a clear distinction in your mind between being a performer who performs musical ideas by composers, and i.e. just being an interpreter, or did you feel that there was some creativity inside you that could, you know, make a blend, and you were empowered that way?
I definitely, I appreciate the tradition, the Western classical tradition of composer, performer, but I actually, I write music too, and I think most of my friends write, even if they don't call themselves composers. And most of my composer friends also are performers as well. So I think there's less of a distinction between those two jobs, so to speak, in the circles in which I run. And I certainly don't think that being an interpreter precludes being a generator of music either. And I do find a lot of creative fulfillment in interpreting, and in being able to work with the composer and say, hey, you know what, this might work better here, because, you know, it's my instrument, I know it best. So that's part of the process that's very fulfilling.
And having stepped outside the orchestral milieu, is there the same kind of gender barrier that you described earlier, or is it avoid that issue?
No, there always is. There's always, this is not something that's going to change overnight, and again, we could have a whole separate conversation about that for hours. But it is absolutely a thing, as they say. With female bass players, there's a side of it that is just as insidious but sort of unique to our situation, which is that there is this sort of fetishization of us as female bass players, and so very often, you know, you'll get hired for something and you'll wonder, oh, did I get hired because they thought I was the best musician for the job, or did they hire me because they like the aesthetic of a female bass player? And so that's kind of a bizarre aspect of the gender issue that is particular to my situation and the situation of other female bass players. But yes, it's absolutely a very real thing. It has not disappeared.
Are there other practical limitations, such as being a bass player in New York City? How do you lug that thing around?
Well, everyone develops their own personal technique. There's a lot of putting it on your back and walking upstairs. We all have wheels. You have to have a wheel. You can't, none of this schlepping, get a hernia in 5 minutes. But, after years and years of practice, everyone kind of has their own way of getting in and out of the subway and getting up and down stairs. And there is a certain amount of technology involved, various different kinds of wheels and buggies and other things.
And when you go on international tours and airplanes, what's your opinion of the airline industry?
Oh, they're not my favorite. We'll put it that way. I can't fly a base anymore. Oddly enough, it's easier to fly a base internationally. You can put it in a hard flight case, and on the larger jets that they use to fly the international routes, it's easier to actually get the thing on the airplane, but they still make you pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And then you have to rent a flight case, because who wants to own a flight case? Because they're really expensive. And then when all is said and done, it's just easier to use a different instrument wherever you go. And domestically, you kind of have to do that anyway. So it's become, bass players have become pretty much like pianists. We just show up, we get an instrument, we get what we get, and we don't get upset. And that's how it goes.
You move in many circles and many ensembles. How do these things support or feed off each other? Or do you feel like a more well-rounded musician as a result?
Sure. I think any person, no matter what they do or what their interests are, should always be challenging themselves to learn and grow and expand their horizons. And I think music is no different. We tend to become specialists as musicians, and sometimes it's helpful to just check in with yourself and say, okay, where is the line between specialist and tunnel vision? So I enjoy playing lots of different genres of music. I've enjoyed recently learning a lot more about old-time music, like Americana and bluegrass and things like that. I think that a lot of the people that I feel like the circles are ever imploding on each other. When you get to a certain level of artistry, it kind of doesn't matter what genre you're in. Good musicians like to work with each other, and I find that I work with a lot of the same people in very different situations, or there are all kinds of strange connections between these little circles. It's like a giant Venn diagram with lots of overlap.
Do you have kind of technical limitations that you would like to break down? Do you invite composers to do things to you that you've never tried before?
This is sounding a lot like that Alex Temple article about the power dynamic between composers and performers. I always my first thing that I say to composers when they want to work with me on something is just write it, and if it's not playable, then it's not playable, but let's try it. I always want to try it first. And that could be, any number of weird technical things. It could be, or it could just be an idea. It could be anything. I'm always interested in trying something at least once. I hope that answers that question.
Oh yeah, just in terms of composers who are string players, they perhaps have a more developed sense of what an idiom is for that instrument, right. Whereas someone coming out to the instrument completely afresh may have absolutely no idea what's easy, what's hard, and yet have a different perspective that you are welcoming.
Well, it's interesting about the pieces that are on this album and the composers who wrote those pieces. You have Florent, who's a bass player, and so he immediately knows the idiom, and what he writes sounds like it was written specifically for bass by a bass player. And then Angelica, who has some experience with string instruments, but had never approached the bass before. Jenny has played some guitar, and she actually wrote the piece partially with an electric guitar. So that kind of infiltrated her approach. There's a lot of chordal stuff in her piece, a lot of double stops, a lot of like guitar effects, and it all works beautifully on the instrument. And then Will's piece, Will is also not a string player at all. And so he kind of approached it as a theater piece, because there is something very dramatic about playing the bass just in physical space. It's very dramatic to watch someone go from here to here, and just every interval is so much larger. And so he kind of was thinking more spatially, I think, and of course he could speak to this better than I could, but there was definitely an aspect of theater there with the beating on the body of the instrument and just the use of physical space of the instrument.
Certainly I know cellists describe themselves as kind of an extension of the instrument, or there's a kind of dynamic going on between the resonance of that body right in front of them and the way they embrace and play it. Is that even more so with the bass?
Well, yeah, because a cello sits between your knees, so you have points of contact here and really a small point of contact here. The bass connects to you right at your core, so it's almost like having a Siamese twin, and you're connected right at the trunk, which is kind of the most important part of your body to connect to something. So yes, there is definitely. And playing the instrument can feel a lot like dancing as well, because you're operating with something so large. So yes, there is definitely a big, major connection that way.
Do you think there's any element we lose by listening to a recording of your performance?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the visual aspect is certainly enhances the experience. It's not absolutely essential, but there is something lost when you don't have the physical aspect, particularly for Will's piece, but for all of the pieces.
So we invite everyone to turn it up really, really loud to compensate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So what's the title of this album?
Home.
Why is it called Home?
Jenny Olivia Johnson's piece is called Home, and it seemed like an apt descriptor for the kind of weird world that I created for myself to live in, and that I hope people will join me in as well. It's a reflection of the home of the instrument, the home of myself within these genres, and also all of the composers on the album I have a personal connection to. So.
And is it the epitome of what your teenage dream had been, to dare to play solo?
I guess so. I never really thought about it that way. Yeah, sure. Yes.
Thank you for telling us about Home and yourself, and we love the album, so good luck with for more.
Thank you. Thanks for asking about it.